In 1887, while empires were busy claiming the globe and archaeologists were busy claiming the relics, a peasant woman in Middle Egypt was concerned with more immediate things. She was digging in the ruins of Akhetaten, a cursed ghost town the desert had tried to swallow 3,000 years before. She wasn't looking for gold or art. She was digging for sebak. It's a decayed ancient brick used in ancient times to build cities, but in her time it was just fertilizer. That's when her shovel struck something. It didn't clink, it thudded. She knelt down, brushed away the sand, and pulled out a clay tablet. It was about the size of a modern smartphone today, pillow shaped and covered in tiny wedge shaped scratches. She kept digging. She found another and another, hundreds of them, a library of panic, preserved in the dry heat of the desert. These weren't grocery lists or prayers to the sun god. They were ancient diplomatic letters of the Egyptian Empire. They were sent from vassal kings of Canaan, places like Gezer and Lachish, Shechem, and Urushalim, which would later be renamed to Jerusalem, written to the pharaoh Akhenaten, begging for his attention. When the scholars finally got their hands on these things, after they had been sold on the black market, broken, nearly dismissed as forgeries, they began to read them. And what they read got the attention of the halls of academia, and they haven't stopped looking at them ever since. They expected to read about the glory of the empire, about tribute and loyalty and Pax Aegyptiaca, the peace of Egypt. Instead, they read the minutes of a meeting where everyone realizes the ship is sinking. Listen to the voice of Abdi Heba, the king of Jerusalem at the time. This is not a man writing a formal report. He's shouting for help. He says this, "To the king, my lord, my son, my God, why do you love the Habiru, but hate the mayors? The Habiru have plundered all the lands of the king. If there are no archers here this year, all the lands of the king will be lost." He writes it again in another letter where the panic is undeniable. He says, "The war against me is severe. The Habiru have taken the very cities of the king. The king has no lands left. All is lost." All is lost. That is the sound of the Bronze Age ending. For hundreds of years, historians and theologians have looked at this period, the 14th and 13th centuries BC, and they've engaged in a very specific and, I would say, very flawed type of investigation. They look at the Bible, which describes a conquest of Canaan by outsiders, a people coming up from the desert, taking cities, burning Hazor, disrupting the geopolitical order. And then they look at the ground, and they demand a smoking gun. They want a stele that says Joshua, son of Nun, general of the armies of Yahweh, slept here. They want a destruction layer at Jericho that can be carbon dated to a specific Tuesday afternoon in April. They want the archaeology to function like a photograph. And when they don't find that specific signed and dated confession, they throw their hands up. They say it didn't happen, or they say that the Exodus is a myth. They call the conquest a pious fiction, written 600 years later by scribes in Babylon who were trying to invent a glorious past for a defeated people. They say the silence of the archaeological record is proof of absence, but that's not how you solve a cold case. If you were a detective walking into a room where a crime was committed 3,000 years ago, you wouldn't expect to find the murderer standing there holding the weapon. You wouldn't expect to find a signed confession on the table. In our situation, the weapon is gone. The body has turned to dust and the witnesses are dead. In a court of law and in serious history, you build a case on corroborating evidence. You look at the blast radius. You look at the scars left in the walls. You listen to the testimony of the neighbors who heard the shouting. We have the neighbors' testimony. It's written on those clay tablets found by a peasant woman in 1887. We have the testimony of the king of Jerusalem, terrified of a group of invaders he calls the Habiru. We have the testimony of the king of Shechem, who's accused of opening the gates to them. We have the silence of the cities that aren't writing letters because they're already in the ash. This series is not about finding a magic artifact that will convince the skeptics on the internet. This is about forensic history. We're going to look at the clearing of the land to see how the first domino of the Exodus caused a collapse in Egypt that pulled the police officers off the street in Canaan. We're going to see how a vacuum was created, a void in the center of the world just big enough for a new nation to step in. And we're going to meet the wrecking ball, the mysterious sea peoples who arrived just in time to shatter the iron empires that would have crushed Israel in its cradle. We're looking at the whole crime scene. And when you look clearly at all of the evidence, without the bias of needing it to be a myth, you realize that the story in the ground and the story in the Bible are the same story. If this is your first time with me, then I encourage you to subscribe, maybe give the video a like. But if you've been around a little while, then the next step for you is to join the channel membership. The channel membership is kind of like the green room, where you get a little bit of the behind the scenes, you get the off the cuff conversations, you get the details and the deep dives, you get your questions answered in detail, sometimes in long videos that are dedicated to a specific question and a long answer. You get a few other perks that come along with the membership, but I encourage you to give it a try. You can always cancel anytime. Join in if you don't like it. You can cancel anytime that you'd like. Oh, one other perk is you get videos like this 24 hours in advance starting this week with no ads for the first 24 hours for members only. So, encourage you to join the membership if you haven't already. Now, back to our story. If you look at the ancient world around 1450 BC, you'll notice something immediately. Canaan isn't a country. It isn't a sovereign nation with a clear border and a seat at the table of nations. Canaan is more like a hallway. It's a narrow strip of coastal land pinned between the Mediterranean Sea and the Arabian Desert. And for thousands of years, it was the single most important highway on Earth. It's the land bridge connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. And in the late Bronze Age, that hallway had a landlord. To the north, in modern day Turkey, you had the Hittite Empire, the masters of iron and heavy chariots. To the east, you had the rising powers of Mesopotamia. But to the south, you had the Colossus. You had Egypt. For centuries, Egypt didn't just influence Canaan, they owned it. It was a province, like a buffer zone. The pharaohs treated the kings of Jerusalem and Megiddo like middle managers. They garrisoned their cities, they taxed the trade routes, they patrolled the king's highway with divisions of chariots that could crush any local rebellion in an afternoon. This is the crucial context that's often missed. If Joshua had arrived on the banks of the Jordan River 50 years earlier, say 1490 BC or so, he wouldn't have been facing a loose connection of scared city-states. He would have been staring down the full mechanized might of the 18th dynasty Egyptian imperial army. He would have been slaughtered, honestly. But he didn't arrive in 1490. He arrived 50 years later. He arrived in the vacuum. In our last deep dive video, we talked about the first domino. We looked at the Exodus not just as a religious event, but as a geopolitical catastrophe for Egypt. We argued that the 10 plagues were a form of asymmetric economic warfare. The death of the livestock, the destruction of the flax and barley harvests, the loss of the labor force, and the drowning of the elite chariot corps in the Red Sea. This wasn't just a bad weekend for Pharaoh, it was a system-wide crash. And when a superpower crashes, it contracts. It pulls back. It stops worrying about the colonies and starts worrying about its own survival. The historical record for this withdrawal is startling if you know where to look. Consider the strange case of Pharaoh Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II was the son of the great Tutmosis III, the Napoleon of Egypt. He was a warrior king. He was famous for his physical strength. Amenhotep II would claim that he could shoot an arrow through a copper target while driving a chariot. In the early years of his reign, he was constantly on campaign, riding north into Canaan, bringing back thousands of slaves and tons of plunder. And then there's just silence. Around 1446 BC, the biblical date of the Exodus, Amenhotep II's foreign policy changes overnight. The campaigns stop. The great raids into the Levant cease. The warrior pharaoh, as he was known, spends the rest of his reign sitting at home. But why? Historians will tell you that he simply lost interest. But empires don't normally lose interest in their primary source of wealth. What they do is they lose the capacity to project power. Even more suspicious is the sudden peace treaty with the Mitanni. The Mitanni were Egypt's arch enemies in Syria. They'd been fighting for generations, and yet, right around this time, Amenhotep II signs a hasty treaty with them. Why do you make peace with your mortal enemy? Well, because you can no longer afford a two-front war. You do it because your economy has collapsed, your army is broken at the bottom of the sea, and you need to stop the bleeding. That was the first domino falling. Egypt blinked. The garrisons are recalled and the patrols stop coming. By the time we get to the Amarna period, a few decades later, the Egyptian military presence in Canaan has evaporated. The difference is staggering. A century earlier, Thutmose III marched into Canaan with 20,000 men to fight the Battle of Megiddo. He was a titan walking among ants. But now, listen to the numbers in the Amarna Letters. The king of Jerusalem is begging Pharaoh for reinforcements. He doesn't ask for a division. He doesn't even ask for 1,000 men. He asks for 50 archers. He says, let the king just send 50 men to protect the land. 50. The ruler of Megiddo begs for 10 men to guard the city gates. 10. The mighty Egyptian Empire, the superpower that built the pyramids, is being asked to send the equivalent of a mall security team to hold down an entire province. And the tragic part is Pharaoh didn't even send that much. He was silent. He never answered, as far as we can tell. This is the evidence of the vacuum. The imperial guard left the post and the forts were empty. This is the world described in the book of Judges. People often read Judges and they wonder why it's so chaotic. Why is there no central government? Why is everyone fighting? The Bible gives the theological answer in Judges chapter 21, verse 25. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The international order had collapsed. The Pax Aegyptiaca, that peace of Egypt, was over. The umbrella of protection that had hovered over Canaan for centuries had been folded up and taken away. This is the reality that Joshua walked into. He didn't have to fight an empire. God had already taken care of the empire. The first domino of the Exodus had cleared the board of the one power that could have stopped the conquest before it began. Instead, Israel walked into a power vacuum. They faced a land of isolated, terrified city-states. Jericho, the city of Ai, Hazor, huddled behind their walls, hating their neighbors and looking south for help that was never going to come. But just because the landlord is gone doesn't mean the house is empty. There were still squatters in the land, and as we're about to see, they were already screaming for help. So we've established the vacuum. The superpower is gone, and the garrisons are empty in the land of Canaan. But how do we know this really happened? How do we know the book of Joshua isn't just a fable written 500 years later by a scribe with a vivid imagination? Well, we know because we can read their mail. Literally, the Amarna Letters are the black box, like recordings of the crash. Recovered from the ruins of the Egyptian Foreign Office, this archive contains nearly 400 clay tablets. They're the diplomatic correspondence between the pharaohs of the 14th century BC and the kings of the known world. Most historians focus on the letters from the great powers, the kings of Babylon and the Hittites, writing to Pharaoh as brother. But our investigation, for us, those letters are really just distractions. We need to look at the letters from the servants, the desperate, frantic dispatches coming from the mayors of the Canaanite city-states. If you read these letters in chronological order, a story emerges. It's a story of a slow-motion collapse, of a new force entering the land, a force that's terrifying the local kings. The Canaanite mayors call this enemy the Habiru. Now, we have to be careful here. Linguistically, the word Habiru, or Apiru, is surprisingly close to the biblical word Hebrew. But in Egyptian usage, it wasn't strictly an ethnic term. It was a social term. It meant dusty ones. It meant outlaws or renegades, displaced people who lived on the fringes of society. So I don't want to jump to the conclusion that the Habiru were the Hebrews because it sounds similar. To an Egyptian aristocrat, a Habiru was anyone who rejected the social order of the empire. The Bible tells us the Israelites were a displaced people. They were wanderers. They were a mixed multitude attacking the southern fringes of the Levant. To a terrified Canaanite king looking over his city walls, the invading Israelites would have looked exactly like Habiru. And what are these Habiru doing? Well, let's look at Exhibit A to start with, the file on Jerusalem, the city that became Jerusalem. The king of Jerusalem at the time was a man named Abdi Heba. And of all the writers in the Amarna archive, he's the most panicked. Listen to his words to Pharaoh. They read like a distress signal. He says, may the king know that all the lands are at peace, but I am at war. The Habiru are taking the cities of the king. No ruler remains to the king, my lord. All are lost. He goes on to name specific generals who have betrayed him. He talks about the smoke rising from nearby towns. And then he delivers this chilling line. If there are no archers this year, all the lands of the king, my lord, will be lost. Abdi-Heba feels surrounded. Why? Because the southern cities have already fallen. The Habiru are moving up the mountain ridge, tightening the noose around Jerusalem. This matches the biblical account of the southern campaign in Joshua chapter 10 perfectly. But it gets more interesting when we look at Exhibit B, the file on Shechem. Shechem was a major power center in the north. Its king was a man named Libiah. But unlike the king of Jerusalem, Libiah isn't asking for help. He's being accused of treason. Other kings write to Pharaoh complaining that Libiah is helping the Habiru. They claim he's given his land to them. They claim his sons are riding with the Habiru bands. Libiah writes back to Pharaoh, sounding like a politician caught in a scandal. He denies everything. He says, I am a loyal servant. I am the dust beneath the king's feet. But his actions betray him. Now, place this alongside the Bible. In Joshua chapter 8, Israel destroys the city of Ai, and then in chapter 10, they fight the southern coalition. But in Joshua 24, something strange happens. Joshua leads the entire nation to Shechem to renew the covenant. There's no battle recorded at Shechem. There's no siege. Israel just walks in. They assemble between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim in the heart of Libiah's territory, and they worship. So why didn't Libiah attack them? Why didn't he close the gates? The Amarna Letters give us the answer the Bible implies. Libiah had flipped. He'd realized the wind was changing. He saw the power of this new God, and perhaps he just saw the weakness of Egypt, and he made a deal. He gave his land to the Habiru. The archaeology of the letters and the narrative of the Bible fit together like a lock and key. And finally, consider Exhibit C, the silence. We have letters from Jerusalem. We have letters from Shechem, from Gezer, from Ashkelon, from Lachish. But do you know who we don't have letters from? We have no letters from the king of Jericho. We have no letters from the king of Ai. We have no letters from the king of Bethel. Why? In a criminal investigation, sometimes the most important evidence is the witness who never shows up. The cities were the gateway to Canaan. If an invasion force was coming across the Jordan River, the king of Jericho should have been the first one writing to Pharaoh. He should have been screaming for help before anyone else. But there's only silence from Jericho, because by the time the Amarna correspondence begins in earnest, Jericho is already a ruin. The city of Ai is already a heap of stones. Their kings are dead. They couldn't write letters because they had been already wiped off the map by the initial thrust of the conquest. The silence of the Amarna Letters corroborates the timeline of the Bible. So, we have the opportunity, that's the vacuum. We have the weapon, the Habiru sacking cities. And now, in the Amarna Letters, we have the victim statements. The Canaanite kings are testifying against themselves. They're telling us that their world is ending, that a new people, a people who look and act and move exactly like the Israelites, are taking the land city by city. And the Pharaoh, he isn't sending help. The letters go unanswered. The vacuum remains. And into that vacuum, a new nation is being born. Up until this point, we've seen how the southern superpower, Egypt, collapsed inward, creating a vacuum. But a vacuum in geopolitics is a dangerous thing. It usually sucks in the next biggest bully on the block. And around 1200 BC, that bully was sitting right on the northern border, the Hittite Empire. This is the complication that most people miss. Even if Egypt was missing from the map of Canaan, the Hittites were still very much alive in modern-day Turkey and Syria. And they were terrifying. They were the masters of iron. They drove heavy three-man chariots that could smash through infantry lines like bowling balls. Israel, by comparison, was a light infantry force. They were hill fighters. They had bronze weapons and slings and spears. But hill fighters can't drive chariots, and their weaponry was still set in the Bronze Age. If the Hittite Empire had decided to move south into the vacuum of Egypt left behind, the conquest of Canaan would have been a very short and very bloody conquest. It would have been bad for Israel. So why didn't they? Why didn't the Hittite legions march south and annex Canaan? Because they were too busy dying, to be honest. Just as Israel was securing its foothold in the hill country, a new player entered the game. They didn't come from the desert, and they didn't come from the river valleys. They came from the sea. Historians call them the sea peoples, but don't think of them as a disciplined navy. Think of them as a force of nature, a hurricane made of men, ships, ox carts, like Mediterranean Vikings 2,000 years earlier. This wasn't a single invasion either. It was a rising tide. The first waves crashed against the shores of Egypt years earlier. Ramesses II, the Great Ramesses, fought off a group of pirates called the Sherdin in a naval battle. He was so impressed by their ferocity that he hired the survivors as his personal bodyguards. Then came the second wave around 1207 BC. A massive coalition of Libyans and sea peoples attacked the Nile Delta. Pharaoh Merneptah fought them off in a desperate battle. And it's here, in the smoke of that victory, that we find a critical clue. To celebrate his win, Merneptah carved a massive granite stele, a victory monument. I discussed this a little bit in the last video. In the final lines of the text, he lists the enemies he's defeated in Canaan. And there, buried in the hieroglyphs, is a name that stops archaeologists in their tracks. It says this: Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. This is the famous Israel stele. It's the earliest mention of the name Israel in secular history, and the date is 1207 BC. This is as close to a smoking gun as we're going to get for this story. It proves that by 1207, Israel was already established in the land. They weren't wandering in the desert. They were a significant enough power that the Pharaoh of Egypt had to brag about defeating them. The timeline matches the Bible perfectly. But Merneptah's victory was just a temporary dam against the rising flood. Because around 1177, the dam broke. The tsunami arrived. We can see them on the walls of the temple at Medinet Habu. The Egyptians carved their faces for us. They wear strange feathered helmets. They carry round shields, long and straight swords. And unlike regular armies, they brought their families. The reliefs show ox carts filled with women and children. This wasn't just a raid. It was a migration at this point. It was a desperate, violent movement of people fleeing famine and collapse in the Aegean Sea, looking for a new home. And they acted as history's unintended mercenaries. They hit the Hittite Empire first, and they didn't just defeat it, they erased it. They had burned the capital city of Hattusa so thoroughly that stones turned to glass. It was millennia before we rediscovered Hattusa again. Then they moved down the coast. They burned the great trading city of Ugarit, Israel's neighbor. They scoured the coast of Canaan like a belt sander, removing every major power that stood in their way. And the Hittites, they were gone. The coastal city-states, they were burned. The trade routes, they were severed. The sea peoples were the bulldozer that cleared the board. They destroyed the Bronze Age superpowers that Israel would have struggled to fight. And then, finally, they hit Egypt. Ramesses III managed to stop them at the very gates of the Nile in one of the bloodiest battles in ancient history. But he couldn't destroy them, he could only push them back. So, after they were pushed back, where did they go? They didn't vanish into the ether, they didn't go back to the sea. They retreated back up the Levant and settled on the fertile coastal plain. Among the groups listed in the Egyptian records is a tribe called the Peleset. The Bible knows them by a different name, the Philistines. With their arrival, the stage was set for the next 4 centuries of history. The board had been effectively reset. The superpowers were gone. The giants of the Bronze Age had been removed. What remained were 2 new nations, eyeing each other across the foothills. On the coast sat the Philistines, survivors of the apocalypse, armed with iron and a warrior culture. In the hills stood the tribes of Israel, survivors of the desert, armed with bronze and a promise from God. The vacuum was filled, and the long war of Judges and Samuel was about to begin. So, where does this leave us today? When secular historians look at the map of the ancient world between 1200 and 1000 BC, they see a catastrophe. They call it the Bronze Age collapse, a dark age. Literacy rates plummeted, international trade stopped. Great cities that had stood for 1,000 years were reduced to ash heaps. The light of civilization flickered and almost went out. But if you look at this same period through the lens of the Bible, you see something entirely different. This dark age was the practical, tangible reason Israel survived in its infancy. Think about the timing for a minute. If Israel had tried to emerge as a nation 2 centuries earlier, they would have been crushed by the Egyptian war machine. If they'd tried to emerge 2 centuries later, they would have been steamrolled by the rising Assyrian Empire. But they didn't. They emerged in the window. They emerged in the only 200-year gap in history where the superpowers were dead and the world was quiet. The chaos of the nations was the safety of God's people. While the coastlands were burning and the great empires were collapsing, Israel was up in the highlands, planting vineyards, digging cisterns, and establishing the 12 tribes. The Dark Age shielded them. It kept the predators away long enough for the roots to go deep in the land. It reminds me of that cryptic verse in Joshua 24:12, where God says, I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out from before you, also the 2 kings of the Amorites, but not with your sword or with your bow. What an interesting verse. For centuries, rabbis and scholars have argued about what the hornet actually was. Was it a literal swarm of insects? Was it a plague? But looking at the history of the late Bronze Age, a different picture emerges. The hornet was the stinging, buzzing, overwhelming swarm of migration and war that destabilized the entire region. The sea peoples, the collapse, the panic, these were the hornets. They cleared the room so Israel could walk in. The land wasn't just won by fighting, it was won by the unseen hand of God. And this time, that hand was called the Sea Peoples. We started this deep dive looking for evidence of a conquest. We found that, but we also found something deeper. I think we found the evidence of a preparation. It's easy to look at your own life sometimes and feel like Israel standing on the banks of the Jordan. You look at the future and all you see are high walls and giants. You see the problems, the reasons why it can't be done. For you, it might be a higher vocational calling or a budding relationship that you know will require the best you can bring to the table. Or maybe you're facing a challenge you've put off for too long, maybe breaking an addiction or building a habit that honors God. But the history of the Bronze Age collapse teaches us a profound theological truth. God is the vanguard. He's the one who goes before. While Israel was still making bricks in Egypt, God was preparing a deliverer for them. While they were wandering in the desert, wondering if they would ever have a home, God was letting the weakness of the Pharaoh become a chronic illness that Egypt never recovered from. And while Israel was settling in the lands of Canaan, God was bringing the sea peoples to the coasts to clear the rest of the surrounding powers. They didn't see it happening. They couldn't read the Amarna Letters. They didn't know about the collapse of the Hittites. But they had the word of God and the voice of preachers telling them to stay the course, remain loyal to Yahweh, El Shaddai, God Almighty. There's a promise in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 24, that echoes this in history. It says, He who calls you is faithful. He will surely do it. The God who calls you to a destination is the same God who manages the journey. If he's promised you a land, for you, maybe it's a calling or a ministry or a breakthrough. That means he's already working in the invisible realities of your life to make it possible. He's clearing the obstacles you haven't even met yet. Isaiah 45:2 says this, I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. Israel thought they were walking into a meat grinder. Instead, they walked into a vacuum. So whatever Jericho is standing in front of you today, walk toward it. You might find that the walls are already cracked, the guards are already gone, and the victory was won before you even drew your sword. I'm Scott, and this is Black Sheep Bible Talk. I'll see you in the next one when we learn about how God preserved his people through the mighty hands of the judges. As global systems collapsed, the earth shook, famines rolled like waves, and the people of the God Most High begged for a mere human king.